What if the most powerful weapon in a war wasn't a bomb? What if it was an illusion? During the Second World War, a hidden conflict was fought. It was a war of perception, a battle for the enemy's eyes and mind. They used paint, rubber, wood, and light to create vast deceptions. They built armies that didn't exist and hid cities in plain sight. This was a time when artists, filmmakers, and even magicians became critical to the war effort. They turned landscapes into canvases and weapons into props. The goal wasn't just to hide, it was to mislead, to confuse, and to make the enemy doubt everything they saw. How do you fight an army of balloons? How do you bomb a city that's actually made of burlap? These weren't just tricks. They were calculated strategies designed to save lives and change the course of history. Plus, number 18, what if you hit a factory under a fake town? The Boeing Plant 2 in Seattle was a problem. A big one. This factory produced a huge number of B-17 Flying Fortress bombers. It was a critical piece of the American war machine, and it was a massive, unmissable target from the air. The 26-acre building is hard to miss. The military knew that if an enemy bomber ever reached the Pacific Northwest, Plant 2 would be at the top of its list. Destroying it would cripple heavy bomber production, so they needed a solution. But you can't move a factory. You can't bury it. You have to hide it where it stands. The job fell to the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. They didn't turn to military strategists for the core idea. They turned to Hollywood. John S. Detley, a set designer, and art director from the film industry, was brought in to oversee the project. He understood that deception was a visual art. He wasn't thinking about traditional camouflage netting. He was thinking on the scale of a movie set. His plan was audacious. He would build a completely fake neighborhood on top of the factory's flat roof. The project began in 1942. It was a massive undertaking. They stretched a gigantic frame of chicken wire and wood over the entire 26-acre facility. On top of this frame, they built a world. It was a detailed, three-dimensional illusion. They constructed fake houses, complete with driveways and little gardens. They built fake streets with fake cars parked on them. To create the illusion of foliage, they used painted burlap and feathers to make fake trees and shrubs. The scale was immense. They used over 2.4 million square feet of netting. The fake houses were made of plywood and canvas, carefully painted to look weathered and real from thousands of feet up. It wasn't just a static model. It had to look lived in. Details were crucial. They even moved the fake cars around from time to time to create the impression of a real functioning suburb. The neighborhood was built to match the surrounding area, blending seamlessly into the actual streets and houses of Seattle. From the air, it was designed to look like a slightly hilly residential area, complete with parks and schools. The illusion was so complete that pilots from the nearby airfields sometimes got disoriented, unable to spot the massive factory they knew was there. A book by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, Rising to the Challenge, documents many of these large-scale concealment projects. Life for the workers inside the factory continued as normal, though now they worked under a vast artificial sky of wire and fabric. The project even had its own strange problems. Because the structures were lightweight and built over the existing roof, access for maintenance was tricky. They reportedly hired people of small stature to crawl through the tight spaces of the rooftop world to make repairs. They called this fictional suburb Owing Wonderland. It was a masterpiece of misdirection, using the enemy's own reconnaissance photos against them. An analyst looking at an aerial photograph would see nothing but a quiet, unremarkable part of the city. The factory had, for all intents and purposes, vanished. Was it ever truly tested? The factory was never attacked from the air. So, in one sense, the camouflage was a complete success, but it's impossible to know if it was the reason. Perhaps the threat in that region never materialized to the degree they feared. But the project itself stands as a testament to creative thinking. It showed that the principles of stagecraft and visual trickery could be applied on an architectural, even urban, scale. It took an artist's eye to see that the best way to hide something huge wasn't to cover it in green and brown patterns, but to disguise it as something utterly ordinary. Were there secondary plans to create fake bomb damage on the rooftop city to convince attackers they had already succeeded. And how many other critical industrial sites received similar but less famous Hollywood-style makeovers that remain undocumented. Number 17, could you make a battleship disappear with pink paint? Color is a strange thing. At sea, it's everything. The water and sky are constantly changing. Finding a color that can hide a massive steel ship in that environment seems impossible. But one man thought he had an answer. And his answer was pink. Not just any pink. This was a specific dusty grayish pink. It was called Mountbatten pink. The idea came from Lord Mountbatten, a British naval officer. During one convoy, he noticed something odd. Of a ship from the Union Castle line, painted a pale lavender gray, seemed to vanish during the most dangerous times of day, dawn and dusk. At these moments, the sky often has a pinkish, reddish glow. Most ships, painted in standard naval gray, would stand out as dark silhouettes against this light. But this one ship just seemed to fade away. It was a moment of inspiration. Mountbatten believed he had stumbled upon a new principle of camouflage. It wasn't about hiding all the time, it was about hiding when you were most vulnerable. He commissioned experiments. They mixed a medium gray paint with a small amount of Venetian red. The resulting color was subtle. It wasn't a bright, shocking color. It was a soft, mauvish tone. The theory, as detailed in various naval archives and mentioned in Peter Padfield's book, An Agony of Collisions, which discusses ship visibility, was straightforward. The pinkish hue would blend with the ambient light of sunrise and sunset, making the ship much harder to spot, especially for submarines looking for targets. For a brief period, the ship would achieve a kind of temporary invisibility. The idea caught on. Mountbatten was an influential figure, and his theory was compelling. Soon destroyers and even some larger cruisers were being painted in Mountbatten pink. The crews had mixed reactions. Some swore by it. They felt safer, convinced that their ship was harder to see during those critical twilight hours. They believed it gave them an edge, but others hated it. They felt the pink color was undignified. More importantly, they argued that while it might work for 30 minutes at dawn and dusk, for the other 23 hours of the day, it made them a highly conspicuous, oddly colored target against a blue sky or gray sea. The debate raged. Was it effective or was it a liability? The United States Navy conducted its own tests on the color. Their findings were not favorable. They concluded that the pink was too visible under most conditions. It simply stood out too much. In the bright light of midday, a pink ship was a clear and easy target. By late 1942, the British Admiralty began to phase it out. Ships were repainted in more conventional shades of gray. The Great Pink experiment was over, but the story of Mountbatten pink is a perfect example of experimental thinking. It was based on a direct observation of light and color in a specific environment. It challenged the standard doctrine that a warship should always be gray. It recognized that camouflage didn't have to be a one-size-fits-all solution. It could be time-specific. The failure of the experiment doesn't make it less interesting. It highlights the incredible difficulty of maritime camouflage and the constant search for any advantage, no matter how unconventional. It was a bold idea that ultimately proved too specialized for the varied conditions of naval warfare. But questions remain. Was the initial observation by Mountbatten a fluke, a perfect combination of weather, light, and distance that couldn't be reliably replicated? How much of the reported success from ship captains was a placebo effect, a boost in morale from feeling like they had a secret weapon? And did any enemy submarine commanders ever fail to spot a ship at dusk, scratching their heads as a pinkish smudge on the horizon simply vanished? Number 16. What if an army was made of balloons? Imagine being a spy. You're flying a reconnaissance plane over enemy territory. You look down and see it. An entire armored division, hundreds of tanks parked in neat rows, artillery guns pointed towards the front. Trucks and jeeps everywhere. It's a massive buildup of forces. You fly back and report your findings. Your commanders redirect their own armies to counter this threat. They move troops, artillery, and planes. They commit huge resources to meet this new army. But the army they are moving to fight doesn't exist. The tanks are rubber, the artillery is inflatable, the soldiers are mannequins. You've been fooled by a ghost army. This was the work of the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops in the U.S. Army, better known as the Ghost Army. This unit of around 1,100 men had a unique mission to deceive the enemy. Their weapons were not guns and bullets. They were inflatable tanks, sound trucks, and fake radio signals. The unit was a strange mix of people. It was filled with artists, architects, sound engineers, and advertising professionals, people whose job in civilian life was to create illusions. Now, they were doing it for the military. Their primary tool was the inflatable decoy. They had M4 Sherman tanks, artillery pieces, and trucks that could be inflated with an air compressor in a matter of minutes. From the air, or from a distance, these rubber decoys were indistinguishable from the real thing. A handful of men could create the impression of a massive armored column overnight. They would inflate their tanks under the cover of darkness, and then make sure they were seen by enemy reconnaissance the next day. As documented in the book The Ghost Army of We, by Rick Beyer and Elizabeth Sales, the level of detail was incredible. The decoys even had fake tracks in the dirt around them to make it look like they had been driven into position. But visual deception was only one part of the trick. An army makes noise, a silent group of tanks is suspicious. So the Ghost Army had a sonic deception unit, they had powerful speakers mounted on trucks, they had recorded the sounds of a real armored division on the move. The clanking of tank treads, the shouts of soldiers, the rumble of engines, they would play these recordings at night, creating the auditory illusion of thousands of men and machines moving into position. They could make a lonely crossroads in the French countryside sound like the staging area for a major offensive. The third part of the illusion was radio deception. An army headquarters is a buzz of radio traffic. The Ghost Army had radio operators who would mimic the signals of a real command unit. They would send out fake messages, creating a web of false intelligence for the enemy to intercept. They could make it seem like a general and his entire staff were located in one area, when in reality they were miles away. The Ghost Army performed over 20 battlefield deceptions in Europe. Their most famous was Operation Fortitude, the massive deception plan to convince the Germans that the D-Day landings would happen at Pas-de-Calais, not Normandy. The Ghost Army played a key role in making that lie believable. By creating a fictional army group under General George S. Patton, complete with inflatable tanks and fake radio chatter in the southeast of England, they tied down significant enemy forces, waiting for an invasion that would never come. Their work is credited with saving thousands of lives. They were a phantom force, using creativity and artistry as weapons of war. But how did they maintain such secrecy that their existence was classified until 1996? Were there ever instances where their deceptions were discovered, and if so, how did the enemy react to realizing they were fighting balloons? And what psychological effect did it have on the men of the Ghost Army, whose job was to create the appearance of war without ever truly fighting in it? Number 15, could you turn a tank into a searchlight? Night is the great equalizer on the battlefield. It provides cover, it hides movement, but it also makes it hard to see the enemy. During World War II, both sides were looking for a way to own the night. The British came up with one of the strangest solutions. It wasn't a new kind of night vision goggle. It was a tank that had its main gun replaced with a massive, incredibly powerful searchlight. It was called the Canal Defense Light, or CDL. The name itself was a piece of misdirection. It was designed to sound boring and unimportant, to hide its true purpose. The CDL was not a defensive tool for canals. It was an offensive weapon. The idea was developed by a British officer named A.V.C. Martel, but it was heavily promoted by Major General J.F.C. Fuller, a tank warfare theorist. The core concept was to use intense light to blind and disorient the enemy during a night attack. Here's how it worked. They took a standard tank, like a Matilda or a Grant, and modified the turret. Instead of a cannon, they installed a powerful carbon arc lamp. This lamp projected a beam of 13 million candle power. To put that in perspective, a modern car's high beam headlight is about 1,200 candle power. This was a blindingly intense light. But it wasn't just a simple spotlight. The light was projected through a narrow vertical slit in a thick armored plate. Inside the turret, a rotating shutter could make the light flicker or strobe at a specific frequency. The effect on the enemy was supposed to be devastating. Imagine being a machine gunner in a defensive position at night. Suddenly, the darkness is shattered by a series of flickering, blindingly bright lights. The strobing effect was designed to be disorienting, causing temporary blindness and making it impossible to aim. The narrow vertical beam also made it very difficult for the enemy to pinpoint the exact location of the light source. All they could see was a dazzling, confusing wall of light. Behind this screen of light, friendly infantry and tanks could advance unseen and protected. The project was developed in extreme secrecy. The crews were trained in isolated locations. Anyone who saw the CDL in action was sworn to secrecy. The British built hundreds of them. The Americans also adopted the technology, creating their own versions. The potential seemed enormous. It was a weapon that didn't use explosives. It used light. It was a psychological weapon as much as a physical one. As detailed in historical armor journals such as those from the Bovington Tank Museum, the technology was sound and the effect was proven in tests. But the CDL had a strange and frustrating history. Despite the resources poured into it, it was barely used in combat. It was deployed during the crossing of the Rhine in 1945, where it did help illuminate the battlefield and suppress enemy fire. But it was never used for the large-scale night assaults it was designed for. Military commanders were hesitant. The technology was new and unproven in large-scale combat. Some leaders worried that the bright lights would just become giant shoot-here signs for enemy artillery. The secrecy surrounding the project also worked against it. Many commanders didn't even know what the CDL was or how to use it effectively. So, this wild, futuristic weapon sat on the sidelines for most of the war. It was a brilliant idea that never got its chance to shine, literally. It represents a fascinating intersection of technology, psychology, and military doctrine. It showed that even something as simple as light could be weaponized in a novel way. But we still have to ask, what if the CDL had been used during the Normandy campaign? You know, could a massive night attack led by 100 strobing tanks have broken the stalemate in the Bocage country? Was the reluctance of commanders a wise precaution or a missed opportunity that cost lives? And what happened to the hundreds of specialized CDL turrets that were built but never used? Number 14, how do you make a plane invisible? Stealth technology seems like a modern invention. We think of sleek black geometric aircraft designed to be invisible to radar. But the idea of making an aircraft invisible is much older. During World War II, a group of American scientists and engineers worked on a project to make a plane invisible, not to radar, but to the human eye. It was called the Yehudi Lights Project. The problem was simple. A plane, even a camouflaged one, appears as a dark shape against the bright sky. This is especially true for planes hunting submarines. A submarine has a very limited window of time to dive after spotting an approaching aircraft. If you could make that aircraft harder to see, you could get closer before being detected, dramatically increasing the chances of a successful attack. The project was run by the U.S. Navy. The scientific principle behind it was known as counter-illumination or active camouflage. The idea is that instead of trying to paint a plane to match the sky, which is impossible because the sky's brightness is always changing, you add light to the plane. You make the plane itself as bright as the sky behind it. If you get the brightness just right, the plane's silhouette will dissolve into the background. The system they developed was ingenious for its time. They mounted a series of lamps along the leading edges of the wings and around the engine cowling of a Grumman TBF Avenger torpedo bomber. These were not simple on-off lights. Their brightness had to be precisely controlled. To do this, they used a photometer, an electronic light sensor. One sensor was pointed forward to measure the brightness of the sky the plane was flying towards. This sensor automatically adjusted the intensity of the forward-facing lamps to match the sky's light. The first tests were conducted in 1943. The results were startling. According to reports from the National Defense Research Committee, the Yehudi Lights system was remarkably effective. An aircraft equipped with the lights could approach to within 2 miles of an observer before being seen. A standard, unlit aircraft could be spotted from as far as 12 miles away. The lights didn't make the plane perfectly invisible, but they dramatically reduced its detection range. It was a huge advantage. It turned a 12-mile problem into a 2-mile problem. The project continued to be developed and refined. They experimented with different arrangements of lights and more sensitive control systems. The goal was to create a system that was robust and reliable enough to be used in combat. It was a pioneering effort in what we would now call stealth technology. It was years ahead of its time, using a closed-loop electronic system to actively adapt the camouflage to its environment. So why don't we see pictures of light-covered bombers in every history book? The project ran into a common problem for innovative technologies. It was overtaken by events. By the time the Yehudi lights were perfected and ready for widespread deployment, another technology had emerged that was even more effective at detecting aircraft radar. Radar didn't care how bright a plane was. It detected objects using radio waves. While the lights could fool the human eye, they were useless against a radar set. The primary threat to anti-submarine aircraft was shifting from visual detection to radar detection. The solution had been perfected just as the problem it solved was becoming obsolete. The Yehudi Lights project was quietly shelved. Its history is a fascinating footnote, a glimpse into an alternate path for stealth technology. It shows that the desire to be unseen is a powerful driver of innovation. The unanswered questions are compelling. If radar had been developed 5 years later, would the skies have been filled with counter-illuminated aircraft? Could the same principle have been applied to ships or even ground vehicles? And how much of the research from the Yehudi Lights project secretly influenced the development of modern camouflage and low observability technologies decades later? Number 13, can you trick an enemy with a doll? Deception in war often involves grand, complex schemes. But sometimes the most effective tricks are simple. During World War II, the British created one of the simplest and most bizarre tools of deception. It was a small burlap doll, about 3 feet tall, filled with straw and sand. It was given a name, Rupert. But Rupert wasn't a toy, it was a dummy paratrooper. The idea was born out of the need to mislead the enemy during airborne operations. When you drop paratroopers, you want to create as much confusion as possible. You want the enemy to think you are landing in multiple places at once. You want them to disperse their forces, sending them on wild goose chases while your real troops land and consolidate at the main objective. How do you create the illusion of a massive airborne assault with limited numbers of real soldiers? You drop thousands of fake ones. The Rupert dolls were designed to be cheap and easy to produce. They were made from simple hessian or burlap cloth, stitched into a crude human shape. They were weighted with sand to fall at a plausible speed. They didn't have a proper parachute. They had a simple canopy that would open and give the impression of a paratrooper from a distance, especially at night. From thousands of feet in the air, in the dark, a falling Rupert looked just like a real soldier. But the deception went further. To enhance the illusion, some Ruperts were fitted with special devices. They had a mechanism that would ignite a small pyrotechnic charge when the doll hit the ground. This would simulate the flash of rifle fire. Others had sound devices that would play recordings of gunfire and soldiers shouting. The goal was to create a complete sensory experience for any enemy troops on the ground. They would see what looked like hundreds of paratroopers landing, and then they would hear the sounds of a firefight breaking out. The most famous use of these dummy paratroopers was on D-Day, June 6, 1944. As part of Operation Titanic, Royal Air Force bombers dropped hundreds of Ruperts over several locations in Normandy, far from the actual landing zones. They were dropped along with a small number of real Special Forces soldiers from the SAS. These soldiers' job was to play the sound effects and create as much chaos as possible, amplifying the illusion created by the dolls. The effect was exactly what the planners had hoped for. German reports from that night described paratrooper landings in multiple locations. They sent troops to investigate these phantom invasions. These units were tied up for hours, hunting for ghosts in the French countryside while the real invasion was beginning on the beaches miles away. The little burlap dolls had successfully drawn real enemy soldiers away from the critical battle. The story is detailed in many accounts of D-Day, including Max Hastings' book Overlord. The Rupert doll is a perfect example of asymmetric warfare. It was a low-cost, low-tech solution to a complex military problem. It didn't require advanced electronics or secret materials. It just required an understanding of human perception and a bit of theatrical flair. It proves that in the art of deception, sometimes the simplest ideas are the most effective. It was a war of misdirection, and Rupert was one of its most unusual foot soldiers. But how many enemy soldiers were actually diverted by these burlap decoys? What was the reaction of a soldier who finally found one of the paratroopers and realized it was a small, straw-filled doll? And were there any instances of Ruperts being captured and reverse engineered, or were they considered too crude to be a real threat? Number 12, why would you paint a submarine blue and white? A submarine's greatest strength is its ability to disappear. It hides beneath the waves unseen, but what about when it's on the surface? Or just below it during World War II, a submarine on the surface or at periscope depth was incredibly vulnerable to attack from the air. Finding a way to camouflage a submarine in the complex and ever-changing environment of the ocean was a huge challenge. The Germans, who relied heavily on their U-boat fleet, experimented with a wide variety of paint schemes. One of the most visually striking and counterintuitive was a pattern of blues, grays, and whites. Instead of painting the entire submarine a single dark color, they tried to break up its shape and make it blend in with the sea and sky. The theory was based on the principles of countershading, a form of camouflage found all over the natural world. Think of a shark or a penguin. They are dark on top and light on the bottom. From above, their dark back blends in with the dark depths of the ocean. From below, their light belly blends in with the bright sunlit surface. It's a simple and effective way to be less visible from both directions. Submarine designers tried to apply the same logic. The US Navy, for instance, developed Measure 32. In this scheme, the upper surfaces of the submarine were painted in shades of dark gray or black, while the sides were painted in lighter shades of gray and haze gray. The idea was to make the submarine less visible to aircraft looking down on it. A dark shape is harder to spot against the dark water. But some German experiments went further, as documented in naval camouflage books like Ship Camouflage by David Williams. They used complex patterns. Some U-boats were painted with wavy lines of different blues and grays, designed to mimic the surface of the water. This was an attempt at disruptive camouflage. The goal was not to become invisible, but to break up the distinctive, long, cigar-like shape of the submarine. The jagged, irregular patterns would confuse the eye and make it harder for an aircraft pilot to identify what they were seeing. The most extreme versions of this involved painting the very top of the conning tower white. This seems completely wrong. A white shape on a submarine should stand out, but the theory was that the white would blend in with the white caps of a choppy sea or the bright glare of the sky. For those brief moments when a conning tower broke the surface, the white paint might just be enough to make a pilot hesitate, to make them question what they saw. Did it work? The effectiveness of submarine camouflage is incredibly difficult to measure. Submarines that survived their patrols came back. Those that were sunk didn't. There's no way to know for sure if a particular paint scheme saved a U-boat from being detected. The environment at sea is too variable. A color that works perfectly in the calm, tropical waters of the Caribbean might be a death sentence in the gray, stormy North Atlantic. The crews themselves had their own opinions, but these were often based on superstition as much as science. Ultimately, the biggest threat to submarines became radar, which didn't care about paint colors. But the period of intense experimentation with submarine camouflage shows the desperate search for any possible advantage. And it was a constant battle between visibility and invisibility, played out in shades of gray, blue, and white on the steel hulls of these underwater predators. Still, we have to wonder, were any specific patterns proven to be statistically more effective than others through combat reports? How were the colors chosen and tested? Were artists and color theorists consulted? Or was it purely trial and error by naval engineers? And did any submarine commander ever refuse a specific paint job, convinced it would make his boat a more visible target? Number 11, could you fake a harbor in the middle of a desert? Jasper Maskelyne was a stage magician. He was a master of illusion and misdirection. When the war broke out, he was convinced that his unique skills could be used for the military. He joined the Royal Engineers and was sent to North Africa. There, in the vast empty deserts, he would attempt some of the most ambitious deceptions of the entire war. His most famous and perhaps most legendary feat was the hiding of the port of Alexandria in Egypt. Alexandria was the main base for the British Mediterranean fleet. It was a vital strategic asset and a prime target for enemy bombers. Maskelyne's task was to protect it. But you can't cover a harbor with a net. You can't move it. So Maskelyne decided to move it, in a sense. He would create a phantom replica of the harbor a few miles away in a desolate bay called Mariut. The plan, as he describes in his memoir, Magic Top Secret, was to create a convincing illusion of Alexandria at night. During the day, the enemy could see the real harbor. But at night, the real Alexandria would go completely dark. No lights, total blackout. Meanwhile, a few miles away in the empty bay, Maskelyne's team would turn on the lights. They built fake buildings, fake docks, and fake ships. They strung up lights to mimic the street lights and harbor installations of the real Alexandria. They even created a fake lighthouse. When enemy bombers flew over at night, they would be looking for the familiar pattern of lights from the harbor. What they would see was Maskelyne's fake harbor at Mariute. To make the illusion even more convincing, they rigged up pyrotechnics. When the bombers started to drop their payloads on the fake harbor, Maskelyne's team would set off a series of explosions and fires. This would give the bomber crews the impression that they had hit their targets. They would see the fires burning below, report a successful mission, and fly home. The real harbor of Alexandria, sitting in complete darkness just a few miles away, would remain untouched. This was deception on a massive scale. It required meticulous planning and split-second timing. It was a piece of theater performed for an audience of bomber pilots flying at 10,000 feet. It was pure magic, using light and darkness to manipulate perception and redirect deadly explosives to an empty patch of desert. Maskelyne and his team, known as the Magic Gang, were involved in other incredible deceptions. They supposedly created a fake army of dummy tanks to mislead enemy intelligence before the Battle of El Alamein. They developed smaller, clever devices like the sun shield, a canvas and wood frame that could be placed over a tank to make it look like a truck from the air. The goal was always the same: control what the enemy sees. Make them believe what you want them to believe. The story of Jasper Maskelyne is controversial. Some historians, like Richard Stokes, have questioned the extent of his achievements, suggesting his memoir may have exaggerated his role. And they argue that many of these large-scale deceptions were the work of a much larger and more organized Middle East Command Camouflage Directorate, and Maskelyne was just one part of it. But whether he was the sole mastermind or a charismatic member of a larger team, the deceptions themselves were real. They happened. The British military did create fake harbors, dummy armies, and camouflage tanks in the desert. The story of the Magic Gang shows that the war was not just fought by soldiers. It was also fought by illusionists, artists, and engineers who understood that the battlefield extends into the mind of the enemy. But the questions linger. How much of Maskelyne's memoir is truth, and how much is a magician's self-promotion? Was the deception at Alexandria truly as effective as he claimed? And can we find German records that confirm bombers were repeatedly fooled? And what other, smaller-scale illusions did the Magic Gang create that were never written about? Tricks that quietly saved lives and then disappeared from history. Number 10. Why paint a tank with bright blue and yellow stripes? When you think of tank camouflage, you probably think of green, brown, or sand colors. The goal is to blend in with the surrounding landscape. But in the early years of the war, in the North African desert, the British adopted a camouflage scheme that did the exact opposite. It was a riot of color. It used bold, geometric patterns of stone, blue, gray, and yellow or tan. It was called the Contour scheme. It was named after its creator, Colonel J.F.R. Contour. The scheme was not designed for hiding. You can't really hide a tank in the flat, open desert. The goal of the Contour scheme was disruption. It was meant to confuse the enemy, to make it difficult for them to identify the vehicle, estimate its range, and even figure out which way it was pointing. The theory was based on principles of modernist art, like Cubism. By painting the tank in a series of sharp, angular patterns with strong, contrasting colors, you break up its familiar shape. A German gunner looking through his gun sight would not see a clear, tank-shaped silhouette. He would see a confusing jumble of lines and colors. This could cause a crucial moment of hesitation. In a tank battle, a 1-second delay in firing can be the difference between life and death. The Contour scheme was an official pattern meticulously laid out in army training manuals. There were specific diagrams showing exactly how the patterns should be applied to different types of vehicles, from light tanks to armored cars. The colors were chosen based on the desert environment. The stone and tan colors were meant to match the ground, while the silvery blue-gray was intended to mimic the color of the desert sky or the haze on the horizon. The combination of these colors was meant to make the vehicle shimmer and break apart visually at a distance. For a period in 1940 and 1941, the British Desert Army was a surprisingly colorful force. Their vehicles were covered in these striking, almost beautiful, patterns. It was a unique and bold approach to camouflage, a direct rejection of the idea of simply trying to blend in. Books on British armored vehicles like those by Mike Starmer, who has extensively researched these schemes, show the precise and artistic nature of the patterns. But the counter scheme was short-lived. By late 1941, it was being phased out. Why? There were several reasons. The scheme was complicated to apply. It required careful masking and painting, which was difficult to do in the field. The official paint colors were often not available, so crews had to improvise, leading to a lack of standardization. More importantly, military doctrine was changing. As the war went on, the emphasis shifted back towards concealment. New evidence suggested that a single, plain, sand-colored paint job was actually more effective at hiding a tank in the desert than the complex contour patterns. The disruptive effect was deemed less important than simply not being seen in the first place. So the colorful tanks of the early Desert War were repainted in plain sand colors, and the contour scheme became a historical curiosity. But it remains one of the most visually distinctive camouflage schemes of all time. It represents a moment when military camouflage was treated not just as a science of concealment, but as an art of confusion. It was an experiment in applying abstract art theory to the deadly business of armored warfare. So we are left to wonder, was the contour scheme's disruptive effect ever quantified in combat reports? Did enemy gunners actually find it harder to hit these brightly patterned tanks? Or was the entire experiment a beautiful but ultimately flawed idea that made British vehicles more, not less, conspicuous in the desert landscape? Number 9, could you hide a warship with wood and canvas? During World War I, the British had a serious problem with German U-boats. To combat this, they created Q-ships. These were merchant ships that were secretly armed with powerful naval guns. They would lure a U-boat to the surface and then, at the last moment, drop their fake cargo holds and open fire. It was a deadly trick. In World War II, a similar idea was used, but in reverse. This was the world of dummy naval vessels. The goal was not to lure the enemy in, but to fool them from afar. The British Royal Navy in particular undertook a program of converting old merchant ships into convincing replicas of their most powerful battleships and aircraft carriers. This was a form of strategic deception. The idea was to make enemy intelligence believe that a powerful naval fleet was in one location, when in reality it was somewhere else entirely. The process was like building a giant movie prop. They would take an old, slow freighter and build a huge superstructure of wood, canvas, and sheet metal on top of it. They would construct fake gun turrets that looked like the massive 15-inch guns of a Revenge-class battleship. They would build a fake flight deck to mimic an aircraft carrier. The level of detail was crucial. The silhouette had to be perfect. From a distance or from the air, these dummy ships were indistinguishable from the real thing. One of the most famous examples was the conversion of the freighter SS Mamari III into a replica of the aircraft carrier HMS Hermes. They built a full-length flight deck and a dummy island superstructure. The result was a surprisingly convincing copy. Another 4 old freighters were converted to look like battleships of the Revenge class. These ships were slow and completely unarmed, but to an enemy spy or a reconnaissance pilot, they looked like a powerful battle squadron. These dummy ships were used to create phantom fleets. They could be sent to a port to create the impression of a major naval buildup. They could be sailed in one direction to draw enemy attention, while the real fleet sailed in another. It was a high-stakes shell game played out on the vast chessboard of the Atlantic Ocean. The existence and use of these vessels are noted in naval history, such as the Royal Navy and the Mediterranean by G.A. Titterton. This form of camouflage was not without its risks. The crews of these dummy ships were in a very dangerous position. They were sailing in a vessel designed to look like a prime military target, but they had none of the armor or weapons of a real warship. If the deception failed and they were attacked, they were completely defenseless. It was a nerve-wracking job. The dummy ship program highlights a key aspect of wartime deception resource management. Building a real battleship takes years and costs a fortune. Building a convincing fake one out of wood and canvas is much faster and cheaper. It was a way to multiply the perceived strength of the Navy without having to build more actual warships. It was a clever use of illusion to achieve a strategic effect. But what was it like to serve on one of these hollow warships, knowing you were a deliberate target? How many enemy reconnaissance reports were filed that listed these wooden fakes as real capital ships? And did any of these dummy vessels ever come under real attack, forcing their crews to face the consequences of their own deception? Number 8, what if your uniform made you more visible? When the United States entered the war, it faced a new kind of combat jungle warfare. The dense, green, chaotic environment of the Pacific Islands was completely different from the fields of Europe or the deserts of North Africa. And standard olive drab uniforms, which worked well in other theaters, were not effective in the jungle. A new kind of camouflage was needed. The solution they came up with was one of the first widely issued disruptive pattern uniforms. It was officially known as M1942 Frogskin Camouflage. It was developed by a civilian horticulturist and editor of Gardening and Home magazine named Norvell Gillespie. The pattern was reversible. One side was a 5-color green and brown jungle pattern. The other side was a 3-color tan and brown beach or desert pattern. The idea was that a soldier could adapt his camouflage to his immediate environment. The pattern itself was a series of irregular spots and splotches designed to break up the soldier's outline against the complex background of jungle foliage. It was a departure from the single-color uniforms that had been standard for decades. It was based on the observation of how light and shadow work in a dense forest. The blotches of color were meant to mimic the dappled light filtering through the canopy. The frog skin pattern was first issued to Marine raiders in 1942 for operations in the Solomon Islands. On paper, it seemed like a perfect solution, but in the field, it had a serious and often fatal flaw. The problem was recognition. The American frogskin pattern, with its spotted design, looked remarkably similar to the camouflage patterns used by some German units in Europe. This became a huge issue after the D-Day landings in Normandy. Some U.S. Army units, particularly elements of the 2nd Armored Division, were issued with the frogskin uniform for the campaign in France. But when they entered combat, they were frequently mistaken for the enemy by their own side. The battlefield was a confusing, chaotic place. A soldier would catch a fleeting glimpse of a spotted uniform in the hedgerows and immediately assume it was the enemy. There were numerous tragic friendly fire incidents. The problem became so severe that the uniform was withdrawn from service in the European theater after only a few weeks. The experiment was over. It was a stark lesson in the complexities of camouflage design, a pattern that is perfectly effective at hiding a soldier from the enemy can become a deadly liability if it also hides him from his friends. The need for effective IFF, or identification friend or foe, was just as important as concealment. Despite its failure in Europe, the frogskin pattern continued to be used by the Marines in the Pacific, where there was no chance of it being confused with enemy uniforms. It became an iconic piece of imagery from the Pacific War. The story of the frogskin uniform is a cautionary tale, as noted in military uniform histories like U.S. Army uniforms of World War II by Shelby Stanton. It shows that the design of camouflage is not just about blending in with the environment, it's also about the human factor, about the split-second decisions made by soldiers under extreme stress. But crucial details remain unknown. How many friendly fire casualties can be directly attributed to the use of the frogskin uniform in Normandy? Was the similarity to German patterns a complete coincidence, or was there some common design influence that researchers are unaware of? And why was the risk of misidentification not caught during the training and testing phase before the uniforms were issued for combat? Number 7, how do you hide from a camera that sees heat? Today, we are familiar with thermal imaging. We see it in movies and on the news. It's the technology that allows you to see the heat signature of people and vehicles, even in complete darkness. But this technology has its roots in World War II, and as soon as the technology to see heat was being developed, scientists were also working on ways to hide from it. This was the birth of infrared camouflage. German scientists in particular were pioneers in the field of infrared technology. They developed early infrared viewers known as Nachtjager night hunter systems, which could be mounted on tanks and rifles. These devices used an infrared spotlight to illuminate a target and a special viewer to see the reflected infrared light. It gave their soldiers a limited ability to see and fight in the dark. As they developed the ability to see in the infrared spectrum, they also realized their own vulnerability. They knew the Allies were likely working on similar technologies. A tank or a truck with its hot engine would glow brightly to an infrared sensor. A soldier's body heat would make him stand out against the cool ground at night. They needed to find a way to suppress these heat signatures. One of the main areas of research was in paints and dyes. Standard camouflage paint, which worked fine in visible light, often behaved very differently in the infrared spectrum. A green paint that matched the color of leaves in daylight might appear bright white or dark black when viewed through an infrared device. This is because leaves have a very specific way of reflecting infrared light known as the red edge. To create effective infrared camouflage, you needed a paint that not only looked like a leaf in visible light, but also reflected infrared light like a leaf. German scientists developed special pigments like chromium EI oxide that could be mixed into their camouflage paints. This ire-absorbent paint helped to make their vehicles and equipment less reflective in the near-infrared part of the spectrum that their early night vision devices used. According to technical intelligence reports gathered by the Allies after the war, such as the CIO's report's Combined Intelligence Objectives Subcommittee, the Germans were well advanced in this field. They also experimented with special camouflage nets and uniform fabrics that were treated to have specific infrared reflective properties. This was a highly technical and secret area of camouflage research. It wasn't about what the human eye could see. It was about controlling a whole different part of the light spectrum. It was a hidden war being fought in invisible light. The goal was to make your soldiers and vehicles' ire dark, to reduce their contrast against the background clutter of the natural environment. The technology was still in its infancy during the war. The early infrared devices were cumbersome and had a limited range. As a result, infrared camouflage did not have a decisive impact on the outcome of the war, but the research that was done laid the groundwork for all modern stealth and camouflage technologies. The principles of managing a vehicle's thermal signature, which are critical for modern tanks and aircraft, were first explored in these secret German laboratories. This early work on infrared camouflage represents a fundamental shift in the concept of hiding. It was no longer enough to fool the human eye. Now, you had to fool the electronic eye of a machine, but how close were the Allies to developing their own operational infrared search devices, and were they aware of the German advances in infrared camouflage during the war? Did any specific German units, equipped with both infrared viewers and infrared camouflaged equipment, achieve documented success in night combat? And what happened to the vast body of German research on this topic after the war? Number 6, could you win a battle with fake noise? The Ghost Army used sound to create the illusion of a phantom army. But the use of sound as a tool of deception, known as acoustic deception, was used in other, more focused ways. It wasn't always about pretending to be an entire army. Sometimes it was about making a small group of soldiers sound like a much larger force, or about using sound to draw enemy fire to the wrong location. This was a key tactic used by special operations and commando units. These were small teams that often operated deep behind enemy lines. Their survival depended on stealth and misdirection. A small team of 6 men could sound like a platoon if they were clever. They could use pre-recorded sounds of battle, but often the methods were simpler and more improvisational. One common technique was to use firecrackers or small explosive charges. A commando team could set up a series of these charges in a wooded area connected by timed fuses. When they were initiated, they would create the sound of a firefight with pops and cracks that mimicked rifle fire. This would draw the enemy's attention to that location, allowing the real team to sneak away in the opposite direction. Or it could be used to make the enemy believe they were being attacked from two directions at once, causing them to split their forces and become more vulnerable. Another tactic involved using the sounds of vehicles. A single Jeep could be made to sound like a convoy. By driving back and forth along a short stretch of road, just out of sight, and by having the soldiers in the Jeep make a lot of noise, they could create the impression of a much larger mechanized force on the move. The sound would carry, especially at night, and an enemy listening post might report the movement of a whole company of vehicles. These kinds of acoustic deceptions are detailed in the memoirs and operational histories of units like the British Special Air Service SAS and the American Office of Strategic Services OSS. For example, in The Phantom Major by Virginia Cowles, the story of the SAS in North Africa is filled with tales of this kind of trickery. Their raids on enemy airfields often involved creating diversions with noise and explosives to draw the guards away from the main targets. This was psychological warfare at its most basic level. It played on the fear and uncertainty of the enemy. A soldier on guard duty at night is already on edge. When he hears the sound of gunfire coming from an unexpected direction, his first instinct is to react to that sound. He doesn't have time to carefully analyze whether it's real or fake. By manipulating the soundscape of the battlefield, these small units could control the enemy's reaction and shape the engagement to their advantage. It was a low-tech but highly effective form of camouflage. It was camouflaging your numbers, your location, and your intentions, not with paint, but with noise. It required a deep understanding of psychology and a flair for the theatrical. It was a performance, and the enemy was the audience. But how were these acoustic deception tactics developed and taught? Was there a formal doctrine, or was it something that was learned through trial and error in the field? Are there any documented cases where acoustic deception went wrong, accidentally drawing friendly forces to the wrong location? And did the enemy ever develop effective countermeasures to distinguish between real and fake battle sounds? Number 5, how do you hide a train track? In railways were the arteries of the war. They carried troops, supplies, and equipment. A single railway line could be vital for an entire front. Cutting that line could paralyze an army. As a result, railway junctions, bridges, and major stations were primary targets for air attacks. So, how do you protect them? You can't hide a whole railway system, but you could try to confuse the pilots trying to bomb it. One of the most ambitious forms of this deception was the creation of fake railway infrastructure. This was particularly common in Britain during the period when they were facing heavy bombing. They built decoy railway lines and marshalling yards and empty fields miles away from the real ones. The process was similar to the creation of other large-scale decoys. They would lay down dummy tracks. These weren't real steel rails. They were often just dark lines painted on the ground or shallow trenches dug to look like a rail bed. From a few thousand feet up, the difference was hard to spot. They would build fake signal boxes and water towers out of wood and canvas. They would park old derelict railway cars on the tracks to complete the illusion. The real trick was to make these fake rail yards look active at night. This is where lighting came in. Planners studied the patterns of light used in a real functioning marshalling yard. They noted the dim blue lights used for signaling, the red glow from the firebox of a steam engine, and the occasional bright flash of a shunter's lamp. They then replicated these lighting patterns at the decoy site. They used carefully shielded lights to create the impression of a busy working railway hub. When enemy bombers came over at night, they would be looking for these characteristic patterns of light. The goal was to make the decoy site more prominent and more inviting than the real one, which would be under a strict blackout. If the deception worked, the bombers would drop their bombs on an empty field, while the real railway line, a few miles away in the darkness, remained safe. This work was part of a massive national effort documented in the UK's National Archives under files from the Air Ministry and the Ministry of Home Security. The program was known as Civil Starfish, Special Fire and Q Sites. This was a clever way to turn the enemy's own tactics against them. The bombers were relying on visual cues to find their targets at night. By providing them with false cues, the defenders could manipulate their behavior. It was a form of camouflage that didn't hide the target, but rather provided a more attractive alternative target. The same principles were applied to other industrial sites. They built, decoy factories, oil refineries, and docks, all complete with their own special effects, lighting, and pyrotechnics to simulate industrial activity, and if bombed, to simulate damage. It was a vast secret landscape of illusion built to absorb the destructive power of an air campaign. But how effective Were these decoy sites in reality? Can we match German bombing records to the locations of decoy rail yards to prove they were targeted? What was the cost of building and operating hundreds of these fake sites across the country? And did the crews who had to man these decoy sites at night, deliberately drawing bombs towards themselves, receive any special recognition for their incredibly dangerous work? Number 4, did women wear camouflage as fashion? Camouflage is usually associated with the military, but during World War II, the principles of camouflage and concealment bled into civilian life in surprising ways. On the home front, particularly in Britain and the United States, camouflage became a part of the culture. It even became a fashion statement. With the threat of air raids, civilian life had to adapt. The government issued guidelines on how to camouflage homes and businesses to make them less visible from the air. This was part of the blackout regulations, but it went beyond just turning off lights. People were encouraged to paint their roofs and walls in dull, earthy colors to help them blend in with the surrounding landscape. A bright white roof could act as a perfect landmark for a bomber pilot. This was camouflage on a domestic scale. But the most surprising development was the emergence of camouflage as a fashion trend. In a time of rationing and austerity, designers looked for new inspirations. The patterns and colors of military camouflage provided a novel and patriotic theme. Fashion magazines from the era like Vogue and Harper's Bazaar show examples of this. They featured dresses, scarves, and hats with disruptive camouflage-like patterns. This wasn't about hiding. It was about display. It was a way for women on the home front to show their support for the war effort. Wearing a camouflage patterned dress was a sign of patriotism. It connected the civilian world to the military world. The patterns were often more stylized and artistic than real military camouflage, using bold colors and abstract shapes. But the inspiration was clear. This trend is explored in books about wartime fashion, such as Fashion on the Ration by Julie Summers. It shows how the aesthetics of war can be co-opted and reinterpreted by popular culture. A pattern designed to save a soldier's life on the battlefield could become a chic design for a cocktail dress in London or New York. The trend also extended to accessories. There were camouflage-themed handbags, shoes, and even makeup kits. And it was a complete aesthetic. This civilian adoption of camouflage is a fascinating example of how the visual language of war can spread. It shows that the impact of a conflict is not limited to the battlefield. It changes everything, right down to the clothes people wear. This was a different kind of experimental camouflage. The experiment was not about military effectiveness, but about social and cultural meaning. It was about taking a symbol of concealment and turning it into a symbol of solidarity. But how widespread was this trend really? Was it a niche phenomenon among the wealthy? Or did it filter down to everyday clothing? Were there any official government campaigns that encouraged the use of camouflage patterns in civilian life as a morale booster? And what did soldiers on the front lines think when they saw pictures of people back home wearing fashionable versions of the patterns they relied on for survival? Number 3, how do you hide bomb damage that hasn't happened yet? Deception in war is often about hiding your strengths. But what if you could gain an advantage by faking your weaknesses? One of the more subtle and cerebral forms of camouflage involved the deliberate creation of fake bomb damage. The goal was to fool enemy reconnaissance and bomb damage assessment. After a bombing raid, both sides would send out reconnaissance planes to take pictures. The attackers wanted to see what they had hit and how much damage they had caused. The defenders wanted to assess their own damage. This information was crucial for planning the next steps. If a factory was heavily damaged, the attackers would move on to a new target. If it was only lightly damaged, they would come back to finish the job. This created an opportunity for deception. A target that had been only lightly damaged or even completely missed could be made to look like it was utterly destroyed. This was a job for artists and set dressers, much like the team that camouflaged the Boeing factory. They would use rubble from other bombed-out sites and carefully place it around the target building. They would use dark paints to create scorch marks and simulate fire damage. They would spread debris on the roofs to make it look like they had collapsed. From the air to the lens of a reconnaissance camera, the factory would look like a ruin. The bomb damage assessment team on the enemy side would look at the photos and tick the box target destroyed. They would then advise their commanders to stop wasting bombs on this location. The destroyed factory could then continue its production, safe from further attack. This was a highly sophisticated form of information warfare. It was manipulating the enemy's decision-making process by feeding them false data. The Germans were known to have used this technique, particularly for their critical U-boat pens and industrial sites. Details of these efforts can be found in post-war intelligence analyses, like the reports of the United States Strategic Bombing Survey. This survey was a massive effort to analyze the effects of the air war, and it uncovered many details about German industrial protection and deception measures. The reverse was also true. A heavily damaged factory that was still partially operational could be made to look completely untouched. This was riskier. It involved quickly cleaning up debris and using paint and canvas to cover up damage. The goal was to trick the enemy into thinking their raid had failed, encouraging them to come back and attack the same heavily defended location again and again, wasting their resources. This type of camouflage required a deep understanding of what bomb damage actually looks like from the air. The deception teams had to be experts in photo interpretation. They had to create a scene that was convincing to the enemy's own expert analysts. It was a high-stakes game of cat and mouse played out with paint, rubble, and reconnaissance photos. But how often was this technique actually used, and how successful was it? Are there specific documented cases where a factory was saved from further attack because of fake damage? And how did the deception teams create convincing-looking bomb craters, which would have been a key indicator of a successful raid? Number 2, could a ship's camouflage confuse a torpedo? Dazzle camouflage is perhaps the most famous and visually striking type of experimental camouflage from this era. But it's also the most misunderstood. The goal of Dazzle was not to hide a ship. A huge ship on the open ocean is impossible to hide. The goal was to confuse, not to conceal. The idea was pioneered by the British marine artist Norman Wilkinson during World War I, but it was refined and used again in World War II. The theory was to paint a ship in a series of bizarre, high-contrast geometric patterns. Bold stripes, curves, and jagged lines of black, white, gray, and blue would cover the hull and superstructure. The result was a ship that looked like a piece of abstract art. This was not random. Each pattern was carefully designed. The purpose was to make it very difficult for an enemy submarine commander to judge the ship's course, speed, and range. A submarine commander looking through his periscope had to make a series of rapid calculations to fire a torpedo. A torpedo is not aimed at where the ship is, but where it is going to be. To do this, the commander needs to know exactly what kind of ship it is, how fast it's going, and what direction it's heading. And Dazzle camouflage was designed to screw up all of those calculations. The confusing patterns would break up the ship's outline. It would be hard to tell the bow from the stern. A false bow wave could be painted on the side to make it seem like the ship was going faster than it was. The intersecting lines could make it hard to judge the angle of the ship relative to the submarine. All of this visual noise was intended to introduce errors into the submarine commander's calculations. If he misjudged the speed by just a few knots or the course by a few degrees, the torpedo would miss. Thousands of Allied ships were painted in a huge variety of dazzle schemes. There was no single standard pattern. Each one was unique. Artists and designers were brought in to create new and more confusing designs. The U.S. Navy had its own extensive Dazzle program, as detailed in resources from the U.S. National Archives and books like Dazzle Disguise and Disruption in War and Art by James Taylor. But did it actually work? This is a subject of intense debate. After World War I, studies were conducted and the results were inconclusive. It was impossible to say for sure if dazzled ships were sunk less often than non-dazzled ships. There were too many other variables. However, there was a clear psychological benefit. The crews of dazzled ships felt safer. They felt they had an advantage. This boost in morale was a real and valuable effect. In World War II, the situation was similar. The effectiveness of dazzle was hard to prove statistically. And as the war went on, the technology of submarine warfare changed. The increasing use of radar and acoustic homing torpedoes made visual targeting less important. A radar set doesn't care what a ship is painted like. As a result, dazzle camouflage was gradually phased out. But for a time, the oceans were filled with these incredible floating artworks. Dazzle represents one of the most creative and audacious experiments in the history of camouflage. It was a direct application of artistic theory to a deadly military problem. It was a bet that you could outsmart a torpedo with a paintbrush. The enduring mystery is a big one. Did dazzle camouflage actually work on a technical level, or was its only real effect the psychological boost it gave to sailors? Were any submarine commanders ever interviewed after the war about their experiences trying to target dazzled ships? And could modern computer analysis of the original dazzle patterns finally give us a definitive answer to whether they could fool a human observer? Number 1. What if the enemy's greatest fear was your greatest weapon? The ultimate goal of all camouflage and deception is to manipulate the mind of the enemy. It's about controlling what they see, what they hear, and what they believe. The most successful deceptions, therefore, are the ones that play on the enemy's existing fears and expectations. The greatest deception of the entire war was arguably Operation Fortitude. It was not a single trick, but a massive, multi-layered system of illusions designed to convince the German High Command of a complete fiction. The goal of Fortitude was to protect the D-Day landings in Normandy. The Allies knew they could not hide the fact that an invasion was coming. The buildup of troops and ships in southern England was too massive to conceal, so instead of hiding their strength, they decided to misdirect it. They would make the Germans believe that the main invasion was going to happen at the Pas de Calais, the narrowest point in the English Channel. To do this, they created a completely fictional army group, the first U.S. Army Group, or FUSAG. This phantom army was supposedly based in Kent, directly opposite the Pas de Calais. To make FUSAG seem real, they used every deception technique they had. They used the inflatable tanks of the Ghost Army to create vast fake motor pools. They built dummy landing craft and parked them in the harbors of southeast England. They created a massive fake radio network that mimicked the traffic of a real army group headquarters. This radio traffic was deliberately designed to be intercepted by the Germans. It contained all the day-to-day chatter of an army preparing for a major invasion. They even assigned their most famous and feared general, George S. Patton, to command this phantom army. The Germans knew Patton, and they believed that wherever he was, the main attack would be. So the Allies made sure that Patton was seen all over southeast England. The deception was also fed through human intelligence channels. The Allies had successfully captured or turned nearly all of the German agents in Britain. This network of double agents, as detailed in Ben McIntyre's book, Double Cross, was now used to feed a steady stream of false information back to Germany, all of it confirming the existence of FUSAG and the plan to attack at Calais. The deception was so successful that even after the landings in Normandy began on June 6, 1944, the German High Command believed it was just a diversion. They were convinced that the main attack, the real one, was still to come at the Pas de Calais. As a result, they held their most powerful armored divisions, the 15th Army, in reserve near Calais for several crucial weeks. They were waiting for an invasion by a ghost army that would never arrive. This delay was critical. It gave the Allied forces in Normandy the time they needed to establish a secure beachhead and move inland. Operation Fortitude didn't just hide the real plan. It created an alternate reality and sold it so completely to the enemy that they refused to believe the evidence of their own eyes. It played on their logical assumption that the invasion would come at the shortest crossing point. It used their respect for General Patton against them. It was the culmination of every type of deception practiced during the war: visual, sonic, radio, and human intelligence, all working together to create a single massive war-winning lie. But the most shocking questions are about the very nature of truth in warfare. How much of the German High Command's belief in the Calais invasion was due to Allied deception, and how much was due to their own internal biases and wishful thinking? If the double agent network had been compromised, would the entire D-Day operation have failed? And in the modern age of satellite imagery and cyber warfare, could a deception on the scale of Operation Fortitude ever be successfully mounted again?